Hey everyone, it's the last review video. How cool is that? So today, Friday, last day, I'm going to do this video is going to review some of the big ideas in Unit 7, and then I'm going to do a second video that'll also be posted where I'll go over things to do to prepare for the exam. So hopefully you watch them both, but I do understand if you just end up doing the videos where it talks about what your AP exam is going to look like and what you need to do. So we'll go ahead. We're going to jump into Unit 7. I'll show you, let me pull them up. I'll show you the terms to add. It's a relatively short list, similar to yesterday, about the same amount. Developmental hasn't really been a big FRQ unit, so pretty small amount there. The big ones there, parenting styles, and then Kohlberg's stages of moral development, and then a little bit with Piaget's. So go ahead, jump into developmental psychology. So remember, developmental psychology, really, like the unit covers pretty much everything from when you're born and actually before when you're in the womb, all the way until when you die. And there is a lot in this unit about physical development. However, we didn't cover it. I don't think you have to worry too much about it. If you've had health class, you've probably covered everything we would have covered in that anyways. And also just not a big one that shows up on FRQs. And if something about physical development does show up on your FRQ, Google it. So these are kind of the three big issues in developmental psychology. So the nature nurture is the big one, which has been a big theme in our whole psychology discussion in our course. This idea of how do genetic inheritance, innate, or that would be your nature, what you're born with, and experience, the nurture part of it, influence our behavior. And specifically looking at the development and how we change over time. A big discussion we had with the nature nurture is intelligence. How does intelligence change over time depending on your environment, or is it kind of hardwired into you from your nature? The other part, continuity and stages. We really focused on like the stage theorist, Piaget, Kohlberg, Erickson, even like Freud would be stage theorist because they believe that we develop through kind of this process or sequence of separate stages. And then the other one, do our early personality traits persist through life, or do we become different as we age? So this was what we talked about with parenting styles. This is a pretty good, I like this image because it shows you the 4 different parenting styles and then kind of gives you different words or different ways to describe that type of parent. And there's 2 different axes here. All right, so the horizontal one is the different range of how demanding those parents are. All right, so parents who are on the low demanding side are permissive or uninvolved. And then the vertical axis is how responsive they are. So, how well do they respond to the needs and wants of the child? So, demanding, how much do they demand of the child? And then responsiveness, how do they respond to the wants and needs of that child? So if you're a permissive parent, that is a parent that is very low on the demanding side, but they are very high in responsiveness. So what that means is you can think responsiveness is like what kind of relationship do they have, or do they have a relationship with the kid? And the best way to describe permissive is like it's that parent that is pretty much more of a friend than anything. So they let you do whatever you want. You have a good relationship with them. You can probably talk to them, but they don't have very high demands of you. Uninvolved would be low on the demanding side, but then also low in the responsiveness or relationship side. So that would very much be what it sounds like, uninvolved. Maybe they're not around. They have some sort of addiction issue that keeps them from emotionally connecting. Maybe they work too much, and then you kind of see they're pretty much, the child is on their own. The two that get commonly confused because they're very similar terms are authoritative and authoritarian. The difference between the two is the type of relationship or the responsiveness level. So, authoritative, they have high responsiveness and they're high in demanding. Right? So, they set clear standards. That's the demanding part. They're assertive, they're going to set their rules, but they're responsive. They're going to be flexible. They're going to talk about it. They're going to have some give and take. All right. And the more responsibility you show you can take, the more responsibility they will give you. So the way I remember that, authoritative, they'll give you a little bit of responsibility as you earn it. And then the authoritarian, high demanding still, so very high standards, high expectations, but they're low on the responsiveness. So it's very much my way or the highway because I said so. The examples you've came up with in your assignment, Red Foreman, good example of that. So it's someone who has clear rules, but don't really explain why those rules exist and don't have a very good relationship with their kids. Cognitive development, talked about this with Jean Piaget. So cognitive development, there's 4 stages. We go sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational. And the big idea here is that your mind, cognitive, talking about mental processes, thinking, problem solving, your mind at a young age is not the same and can't do the same abilities that you can currently do when you're at the highest stage of cognitive development. And before Jean Piaget came up with this, that wasn't the thought. Most people just thought a child had a slower version of the mind than an adult. So sensory motor, this is birth to 2 years. So they're very much they're experiencing the world with their senses and their motor skills. So they're crawling, grabbing things. If you've ever had a baby or a toddler around, right, they're grabbing things, they're trying to suck on things. All of that is because that's how they experience the world and how they learn about the world. So recognizes itself as an agent of action and begins to act intentionally. All right, so they're grabbing things, they're making noises, and they realize that they have that ability. They have the idea of self as an agent. They can make themselves do things. And then one big part of it is they're eventually going to, in this stage, achieve object permanence, which is an object exists even when it's out of sight. Then we move on to pre-operational. This is when they're going to start using language to represent objects. So once again, 2 to 7 is really when you see a huge jump in vocabulary because they're in the pre-operational stage. One big thing here is they're still very egocentric, that they only view things from their own perspective, which maybe some people today are still a little egocentric. Anyways, but and then you can also see there they classify objects by a single feature. So groups together all the red blocks regardless of shape. So like all the reds go together, all the blues go together because there's just that one feature that categorizes them. Moving on, concrete operational, you can think logically, and logically is step by step. And also concrete thinking, where like you have the objects there. So typically they achieve conservation of number by age 6, mass by age 7, and weight by age 9. Conservation is understanding that if I have a piece of Play-Doh and I rip it apart, those 2 pieces of Play-Doh is still the same mass, right? Same with the water one, right? The size of the cup doesn't determine the volume of the water. And then formal operational, that's the last one. And now you can think logically about abstract propositions. That's like hypothetical situations. You can test hypothesis. The big thing there is that abstract thinking. You can do thinking in your mind now, make predictions about the future. You can start to problem solve ahead of time, all that good stuff. Moral development. So moral development is just a little bit more specific. Whereas like cognitive development is all thinking processes and problem solving. Moral development is technically cognitive because it's talking about how do we determine what's right and what's wrong. So here there's 6 stages and then 3 levels. You really just need to know the 3 levels and the names that go along with those. And then the stages within are just a little bit more specific. So pre-conventional is when values are based on external events. So you can do something to avoid punishment. That would be stage 1. Using some operant conditioning there. If the kid knows that they're going to get punished for it, then they're going to think it's wrong because there's a punishment. All right, there's external event. Then you move on to conventional, which is where you assess the personal consequences. This is where you start to kind of break out of egocentrism. You start to understand that other people have a certain perspective on you. So stage 3 would be decisions based off of the approval of others. And then stage 4, judgments based on the relative rules and laws of society and whether or not you agree with those. And then the last one, the highest level, post-conventional. This is shared standards, rights, duties, and principles guide your expectations of what's right versus wrong. So social contract rules are like you help me, I help you. In our society, these are things we're supposed to do to help out the greater good. And then the last one there, guided by moral principle of justice. That might be like religious based or just the idea that all lives are equal, anything like that. So post-conventional, much more morals, standards guiding your opinion of what's right versus wrong. Conventional, others and the perception of others on you guiding what's right versus wrong. And then pre-conventional is just what's the external event that happens as a result of my behavior. Erik Erikson, this one too. So really, if you think like the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional are kind of some big FRQ terms. And then Erikson's stages sometimes get thrown in there as well. But really the ones that most often get put in there are 5 and 6, because those are the ones most relevant to you. And usually FRQs are somewhat relevant to high school students. They like to do that, make it a little easier for you. So identity versus, the background here with psychosocial development by Erik Erikson is essentially the idea that at each stage you have a crisis. So that's why he's a neo-Freudian, because we're looking at how crises and how you solve those conflicts changes your personality. And this one looking specifically at social conflicts. So like, for example, if we think about identity versus confusion, if you look what happens at this stage, teenagers are working to refine a sense of self by testing roles and then integrating them to form a single identity, or they become confused about who they are. So where you're essentially trying to figure out the answer to the question, who am I? Who do I want to be? If you're successful at answering that question, you have what we call, you develop an identity, feel very confident in yourself. And then if you fail, we call it role confusion, and you don't feel very confident in who you are, and you may not feel like you fit in or are on the right path. And then the last one here. So this is kind of a research methods term, but it gets put in here when we're talking about developmental psychology and how we study developmental psychology. So there's 2 real big ways that we can study different topics and issues and questions in developmental psychology. Because obviously when we're talking about developmental psychology, it's a wide range of time. So there's 2 different types of studies we can create to look into the topics of developmental psychology. So the first one here is a cross-sectional study. This is the easiest one to do. It takes the least amount of time, and you'll understand that here. It's because you have different groups, but you compare them and just test them once at the same time. So say, for example, we want to look at how does intelligence change over the lifespan. So a cross-sectional study would be we give 3 groups an IQ test. Group 1 might be a 10-year-old or a group of 10-year-olds. Group 2 might be a group of 25-year-olds. And then group 3 might be 50-year-olds. So we give them the IQ test. They all take it at the same time. We get the data back. We can compare the IQ scores amongst the three groups and see how it changes. Now, obviously, the big part there is it's hard to control for confounding variables. That just might be, the group that's 50-year-olds here are probably having a much different educational experience than the 25-year-olds. 25-year-olds are probably in their prime of educational time rather than the 10-year-olds. So it's hard to actually tell how IQ has changed. The one that's can be a little bit more descriptive and show you give you a better idea of how things change as one individual develops is a longitudinal study. However, they're very difficult to conduct because they take a long time, and you have to have people that are willing to stay in the experiment for a long time, right? Like in the cross-sectional study here, the people that were in this experiment or study, they just had to take an IQ test, which maybe took them 2 to 3 hours. Then they're done. Now, in a longitudinal study, the same group is going to be compared multiple times over their lifespan. So if we take the same idea, we want to look at how those IQ change over time. We're going to have group 1 here. So this would be the same group of 10-year-olds. They're going to take an IQ test when they're 10. Then that same group of individuals is going to take an IQ test the second time when they're 25 years old. Then so that would be 15 years. And then that same group takes the test the third time, and this is when they're at 50 years old. So now it's 25 years after. So really, you have to have these people stay in the study for 40 years, and you have to keep track of them enough and have them come back 3 different times to take the test. So that's much more logistically, it's difficult. It's more expensive, and you also have to have the experimenters stay with the experiment for 40 years. So that's a term. It's a research method term, but it also is relevant to developmental. I think I have it on the list of suggested terms for Unit 1, research methods, but I just wanted to put it in there so you had that. So now there's a Google form check-in. There's no multiple choice questions or anything like that. It's more you sharing your understanding of what you need to do next week on Tuesday. So if you haven't watched the video that I'm going to post that goes over what you need to do and have prepared for Tuesday, make sure you do that and then take the Google form check-in to wrap up.